She thought she was doing me a favor. That's the part that still gets me, even now. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway of the house I had quietly paid for of the last 11 years, arms crossed, chin up, and told me I needed to figure out my own situation. She actually used those words, figure out your own situation. Like I was a college roommate who'd overstayed my welcome. Like I hadn't been the one who called the mortgage company on her behalf when she and my son missed 3 payments back in 2019. It was the last week of November, cold enough in Indianapolis that your breath comes out in little clouds that disappear before you finish your sentence. I remember standing on the front step with one bag and my car keys, watching the door close and thinking, she has absolutely no idea what she just did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate business in Indiana, nothing flashy. I didn't have a name anyone would recognize. I wasn't in the news. I bought distressed properties, held them, leased them, sold them when the time was right, and bought more. I drove a 10-year-old truck. I wore the same style of flannel shirt I'd been wearing since 1987. My accountant used to joke that I lived like a man making $40,000 a year while quietly accumulating assets most people couldn't imagine. He wasn't wrong. My wife passed in 2016. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end, she was the only person outside of my attorney and my accountant who knew the full picture of what we had. We built it together, quietly, the way people from her generation and mine tended to do things, without making a production of it. After she passed, I made some decisions. I liquidated a few properties. I set up a trust. I restructured things so that on paper, if you looked at my checking account or my tax return, you would see a retired man living modestly on Social Security and a small pension, which was true. That was also true. I just wasn't only that, my son. I'll call him my son because that's what he is. Married a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law because that's what she became. I want to be careful here. She wasn't a bad person in the beginning. She was ambitious, which I respected. She came from a family that measured everything in dollar amounts, which I understood, even if I didn't share that value. In the first few years, we got along fine. Then my son's business failed. He'd opened a landscaping company, and it grew faster than he could manage. He made some bad hires, had some equipment stolen, lost a major contract. Within 18 months, it was over. He came to me and I helped him. Not in a way anyone would have noticed. I covered what needed covering, quietly, and told him it was a loan. Because I didn't want him to feel diminished. We shook hands. He was grateful. For about a year, he was genuinely grateful. Then she started setting the temperature of the house. I don't mean the thermostat. I mean the way a certain kind of person moves into a space and slowly rearranges everything, including the relationships. Comments that started small. Dad, I think you've been leaning on us too much. Questions about my finances at family dinners, worded so casually you could almost miss the inventory happening behind her eyes. My granddaughter's birthday, which I had attended every year since she was born, suddenly had a schedule conflict. The one year I mentioned I'd be staying an extra week. I understood what was happening. I didn't fight it. I've been alive long enough to know that fighting that particular current is exhausting and usually pointless. I stayed quieter. I visited less. I watched. What I did not anticipate was the job. I had taken on a part-time consulting role with a property management firm about 2 years earlier, not for the money. I did it because I was bored, because I missed working, because sitting in my apartment watching television felt like a slow disappearance. The work suited me. Then the firm was acquired, restructured, and the consulting arrangement ended. Clean, professional, no hard feelings. I was 71 years old, and I had just lost my job. My son found out through a cousin before I had a chance to tell him myself. He called me the next morning. The conversation was short. He said he needed to talk to me in person. I drove the 40 minutes to their house, which I had been doing for years, parked in the driveway of the house whose mortgage I had guaranteed, and walked inside. She was sitting at the kitchen table. My son was standing by the counter. I could tell immediately that the words about to come out of his mouth had been arranged by someone else. He told me that they had been doing a lot of thinking, that they were concerned about my financial situation, that the arrangement of me visiting and sometimes staying for stretches of time was putting a strain on their household, that they needed to focus on their own family unit, that they thought it would be better for everyone if I found somewhere more stable to be. She nodded the whole time he talked. I looked at my son. I thought about the night his mother died, how he had wept in the hospital parking garage where he thought no one could hear him, and how I had stood behind him quietly because I didn't know what else to do. I thought about the loan that had never been repaid. I thought about the 11 years of mortgage payments that had come out of an account she had never once asked about. I said, "All right." That was it. I picked up my bag. I drove away. She watched from the doorway. I could see her in the rearview mirror, already turning back inside before I reached the end of the block. I called 2 people that evening. The first was my attorney, a man I'd worked with for over 2 decades. His name is not important, but his attention to detail is extraordinary, and I have never once regretted having him on my side. I told him to pull up the file on the house. I told him to pull up 3 other files as well. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked me twice if I was certain about the direction I wanted to go, and I told him twice that I was. The second call was to my financial manager. I gave him 4 instructions. They took about 6 minutes to execute. Afterward, he asked if I wanted to talk through the downstream effects. I told him I was familiar with the downstream effects. The next morning, I checked into a hotel downtown, ordered room service for the first time in probably 15 years, and sat by the window watching the city go about its business while mine quietly got underway. Here is what my daughter-in-law did not know. The house they were living in, the house she had remodeled twice, the house where my granddaughter had grown up, the house whose address she put on her Christmas cards, was not owned by my son. It had never been transferred to his name. It sat inside a property holding company that I had established in 2009 during the period when my son's business was collapsing and I had stepped in to prevent the foreclosure. The paperwork my son had signed at the time in his relief and gratitude had not transferred ownership. It had established a leasing arrangement with a deferred purchase option that had quietly expired 18 months earlier without being renewed. He had been living in my property for 11 years under the impression that the house was his. I want to be honest about something here. I had never intended to use that fact the way events were now requiring me to use it. My original plan, vague as it was, had been to simply transfer the property to him eventually, probably as part of a larger estate arrangement. The legal structure was a formality, a protection. It was never meant to be a weapon. But she had made her position clear, and I had made mine. The second thing she did not know was that my son's employer, a regional distribution company where he had worked for the last 4 years, operated out of a warehouse complex that was part of a portfolio my holding company had acquired in 2021. I was, several corporate layers removed, effectively his landlord. When his company's lease came up for renewal in the spring, that conversation would go through my attorney. I am not proud of all of this. I want to say that plainly. I'm not sitting here enjoying the architecture of it. I'm telling it the way it happened. 3 weeks passed. I did nothing visible. I let them settle back into their lives, let her congratulate herself on the cleaner household. Let my son convince himself he had made a difficult but adult decision. I visited my granddaughter once, briefly, in a way that had been pre-approved through a carefully worded text message. She was 9. She had no idea any of this was happening. I sat with her for 2 hours and helped her with a school project about the water cycle. Before I left, I hugged her and told her I loved her, and I meant it more than I'd meant anything in recent memory. That evening, I called my attorney again. I told him it was time to move forward with the notices. The first letter arrived at the house on a Tuesday. It was from the property management division of my holding company, informing the occupant that a title review had identified an administrative irregularity regarding the ownership structure of the property, and that a formal clarification process was being initiated. It was written in the specific, bloodless language of legal correspondence. the kind that sounds almost routine until you read it twice. My son called me that same evening. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard since he was a teenager and had done something he knew was wrong. He asked me if I knew anything about a letter they'd received about the house. I told him I'd look into it. He said, okay. He said, thanks, Dad. I held the phone for a moment after we hung up. The second letter arrived 10 days later. This one was more specific. It outlined the ownership history of the property, referenced the expired purchase option, and formally notified the occupants that the property would need to be vacated within 90 days pending a decision about its disposition. It included documentation. It included the lease agreement my son had signed in 2013 with the relevant clause highlighted. She called me this time. Not my son. Her. Her voice was different than I had ever heard it. The managed quality was gone. She sounded like someone whose floor had disappeared. She asked me if this was really happening. I told her it was. She asked why. I said, you told me to figure out my own situation. I'm figuring it out. There was a long pause, then she said, very quietly, the house. We put everything into this house. I said, I know you did. She asked about my granddaughter. She asked where she was supposed to go to school. Her voice broke on that sentence, and I want to say clearly, that part was hard. That part was not satisfying. A 9-year-old child's school district should not be a variable in her grandparents' disputes, and I hated that it was. I told her that my granddaughter's situation was something I intended to handle separately, and that she did not need to worry about that. I told her I had already established an education trust in my granddaughter's name, fully funded, that would follow her regardless of where the family landed. I told her I had done that the morning after I left. Another silence. Then she said, why didn't you just tell us? I thought about that question for a long time before I answered. I said, because it shouldn't have mattered. Whether I had a job or didn't. Whether I had money or didn't. The door shouldn't have closed. She didn't say anything to that. I gave them the 90 days, and then I gave them 30 more. I was not trying to put my granddaughter on the street. I want that to be understood. What I was doing was making visible something that had been invisible. The weight of what I had quietly carried for them, which they had never once acknowledged, because they had never once been told it was there. My son came to see me about 6 weeks into the process. He came alone. He sat across from me in the hotel restaurant where I'd been eating most of my meals, and he looked like a man who had spent several weeks sleeping poorly and thinking hard. He ordered coffee he didn't drink. He looked at his hands a lot. He asked me why I had never told him the house was still in my name. I told him the truth. I said I had planned to transfer it, and I had never gotten around to it. And then things between us changed, and then the moment passed. He asked if any of this, the letters, the notices, was really necessary. I told him that I had spent the better part of a decade watching myself become a guest in a situation I had largely underwritten, and that the morning I drove away from his house with one bag, I realized the only way to have a real conversation was to make what was invisible. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, I let her run things. I said, I know. He said, I shouldn't have. I said, no. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. I want to be honest about that too. You don't undo years of drift in one hotel coffee conversation. But something shifted. He asked about the warehouse lease. Somehow he had put it together on his own. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just told him there were a lot of things about my situation he hadn't known, and that I had never wanted them used as leverage, and that I didn't particularly enjoy the position we had both arrived at. He asked what I needed from him. I told him I needed him to stop outsourcing his judgment about his father to someone who had never once called to check on me. He flinched, but he didn't argue. Here is where things stand now, and I tell you this, not as a triumph, but as an accounting. The house was transferred. I retained an attorney to execute a proper deed transfer, not the informal arrangement we'd had before, but a real transfer, with my son's name on it, conditional on a straightforward family agreement that my attorney put together. My daughter-in-law signed it. She signed all of it. Her handwriting on those pages looked nothing like the bold, confident signature I had seen on her Christmas cards. The warehouse lease renewed on standard terms. I made sure of that. My son didn't need to know the details, and he doesn't. My granddaughter is in the same school. Her trust is funded. She will be fine. My son calls me most Sundays now. Sometimes we talk for 10 minutes. Sometimes closer to an hour. He came to help me move some furniture last month, and we spent the afternoon working together without saying much, the way fathers and sons sometimes can, and it reminded me of when he was young and good at being in a room with me. I don't know what my daughter-in-law thinks of me. I don't spend much time wondering. She is polite when I visit. She makes sure I have coffee. She does not leave the room when I walk in. It's not the family I thought I was building, but it's the one I have, and I have learned, at 71, after everything, that sometimes the only way back to something real is through something hard. The door that closed on me in November opened a different door. A smaller one, maybe. Less decorated. But when I walk through it now, nobody is looking past me to figure out what I'm still worth. That's enough. I've thought about that November a lot. Not with bitterness. I want to be clear about that. More the way you think about a fever that finally broke. Unpleasant while it lasted, but afterward you feel cleaner than you did before. What happened between me and my son and his wife wasn't unusual. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud. Families drift. People marry into arrangements they didn't build and don't fully understand, and they start making decisions based on what they can see. The old truck, the flannel shirt, the part-time job that just ended, without knowing what's underneath. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw a liability. She wasn't inventing that picture. I had let it be the only picture available. That was my error. Not the legal structures, not the quiet finances. Those were just how I'd always operated. The error was believing that love between a parent and a child is self-sustaining, that it doesn't need tending, that I could withdraw from the relationship for years, grow quieter, visit less, ask for less, and the foundation would hold on its own. It doesn't work that way. You can't go hands-off with something living and expect it to stay healthy. My son let her run things because I had stopped showing him how a man holds his ground. I had modeled disappearance, and she filled the space I vacated, what I understand now. What those months of hotel rooms and legal correspondence and long phone calls with my attorney taught me is that strength kept hidden is not really strength. It's a door locked from the inside. It might protect you, but it doesn't build anything. The moment I finally made visible what had always been true, that I was not helpless, that I had never been helpless, something shifted, not just in my son, but in me. I had been performing smallness for so long I had half convinced myself it was real. My granddaughter did not ask for any of this. She is 9 years old and she knows her grandfather helps her with homework about the water cycle and shows up when he says he will. That's all she needs to know right now. Her trust is funded. Her school is stable. Whatever her parents work out between themselves, she will be okay. Making sure of that before anything else, before any of the legal maneuvering, was the only decision I made in that whole period that I feel entirely at peace with. Here is what I would tell anyone in a situation like mine. Not as advice, because I'm not in the advice business, just as what I learned. The people in your life will treat you according to the story they believe about you. If you let that story go uncorrected for long enough, they will stop questioning it. They will make decisions based on it. They will build their confidence on top of it. And when the real story finally surfaces, the shock is not just surprise. It's the specific discomfort of realizing how much they had underestimated someone who let them. I don't regret being quiet for most of my life. That's just who I am. But I do regret confusing quiet with invisible. One is a choice. The other is a slow erasure. My son calls on Sundays now. Last week he called on a Thursday just to ask how I was doing. It was a short call. Nothing important was said, but he called on a Thursday, which he had never done before, and I stayed on the line a little longer than I needed to. Some doors close hard, but sometimes that's the only way to find out which ones were worth opening again.